Good evening, everyone. So glad you could join us for this exciting talk. And I'm Dorothy Clark, a member of Partnership of Historic Bostons and your moderator for this evening. So I just have a few words I want to say before we get started, and I'm going to make sure I don't give you any spoilers. Uh, our speakers will have some great information to give you, so I don't want to mess it up. But I've got some housekeeping items I'd like to share with all of you. So, first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing tonight. And we've got historians Jeanne Pickering and Krystina Yeager, and they're going to be talking about two women who lived in Beverly at different times, but there's this link between enslavement, poverty, and witchcraft. So I think you'll enjoy that a lot. So we've got Jeanne Pickering, who is a historian of slavery in the 18th century in Essex County here in Massachusetts. Jeanne has a master's in history from Salem State University, and uh, she wrote her thesis on freedom suits, which were used early on by enslaved people to receive their freedom during the Revolutionary period. So Jeanne specializes in doing research and searching for enslaved people in local archives using court, probate records, and town and church records. So she does a lot of presentations and at history venues, academic conferences, and she also maintains several online databases of the research that she's done. Her website is northshoreslavery.org, and I will put that in the chat for you shortly. Now, Krystina specializes in early modern witchcraft trials of England and New England. And she's got a particular focus on the role of the witch's familiar and counter magic practices. Krystina has spoken internationally on this subject, and she has shed a lot of light on the intersections of folklore and religious belief in witchcraft accusations. So she works at Historic Beverly as the education manager and develops programs and field trips, curriculum resources for audiences of all ages so that they get to know the rich and complex past of Salem, um, or that area, Essex County. Now, we will be taking questions after their presentations, and you can put any questions you have in the chat, and I will gather them and ask our speakers. And also, I wanted to let everyone in attendance know that we will be sending out an email with a survey of how you enjoyed this program and how you can get a copy of the recording because we are recording it and it will be available on the Partnership of Historic Boston's website. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Partnership of Historic Boston's, well, we're an all-volunteer public history organization and we offer free events, and we also welcome donations to help defray those expenses. Very important to us so that we can keep our history or free and public. So whether, you got 10, 25, $50 more if you like, do give us a donation. We would really, really appreciate that. And the last thing I do, I'd like to tell you some upcoming events because I don't want to keep everyone waiting, although I'm sure you're all getting really, really excited about what you're going to hear from our presenters. So, first of all, November 6th, which I believe is next Thursday, the month is half over by then. We're going to have historian Francis Bremer talking about resisting tyranny and defining liberty. And on, let's see, November 19th, our next talk will be by British historian Rachel Foxley, talking about radicalism in England during this period. And another fun thing we've got happening is a walking tour. It's a 90-minute walking tour on, let's see, November 8th. That's a Saturday. Rain date is November 9th. So this is like a trip through colonial Boston. And we'll be following in the footsteps of the first people of Shawmut. It would be the people who were here. They weren't discovered, they were here. And Puritan founders, and what happened when these two worlds met up. Now, there's a limitation of 20 people, so just go to our website and sign up as fast as you can. And this tour is recently revised. So I went on it at the end of summer, I think in August or early September, and it really is exciting. So I suggest that you try to check that out. Okay, so I am to stop running my mouth and hand this over to our speakers.
Okay.
Okay.
There you go. All right. Hi, thanks. I'm Jeanne Pickering, and I am, as Dorothy said, a graduate. I have a master's degree in history from Salem State University, and Krystina and I didn't meet there, although she also has a master's degree in history from Salem State University. We were both advised along the way by Dr. Emerson Baker, who gave those wonderful presentations earlier in this fall. So I guess we met later because she works for Historic Beverly. I am a volunteer at the Topsfield Historical Society where I live, and Krystina is great. And we had gone and talked to her about doing some third grade education programming, and she is now going to be helping us out with that, which we're very excited about. So that's us. And in my studies, if you heard, I gave a talk last spring. If you were there, you know that I studied the freedom suits that people filed in the 1760s, 70s, and 80s. And there were a range of them, but the very first one was in 1765, and it was by a woman named Jenny Slew, which she's pretty well known in Ipswich. That's where she was actually she was in Hamilton, but at the time it was part of Ipswich. And I asked a question that apparently nobody had ever asked before, which was, well, who are the Slews? Why did she give herself the last name Slew? And I went looking for it and discovered that there was only one family of Slews, and they were in Beverly. And I was kind of curious about that. So the more I explored, the more I discovered that the Slew family, which was a white family, very poor, so they clearly did not own or enslave Jenny at any time, and but they were descended from a woman named Dorcas Hoar, who was an accused witch during the Salem witch hysteria. So that I thought, oh, okay. So I wonder if those two get put together. And that started me down a very long path. Jenny herself was born probably about 1715, so it was after the witch hysteria. She was held as a slave by John Whipple Jr. in what was called the Hamlet in Ipswich, which is now Hamilton. And in 1765, she sued for her freedom against John Whipple and won it. Now, those of you who are not familiar with Essex County, this is Essex County in general, a modern day map, obviously. But what I wanted to show you was this is now Hamilton. which at that time was again part of Ipswich, which is north. Here's Salem, and probably everybody knows where Salem is. And Beverly is just below it. So at the time, Beverly and Ipswich, I believe, had a border, and Krystina might be able to correct me on that. But the Balch House is one of the houses owned by Historic Beverly, and a very famous area, which I will get back to when we get to my section of the talk. But I'm going to leave it there because Krystina really she's going to tell the 1600s story. She's going to tell the story of Dorcas Hoar and the accusations made against her, and on several decades, actually. She's the one that gets the fun stories. So I'm going to let her continue now. Oh, Krystina, no, you're muted.
Hello, everybody. My name is Krystina. I'm the education manager at Historic Beverly, like Dorothy had mentioned at the beginning. A lot of my work that I do at Historic Beverly is around the history of enslavement, and that's how I met Jeanne with the projects that we were working on. So the third grade project that she mentioned, she had come to Historic Beverly. We were at the Cabot House. We were talking about it. And as she was leaving, I was kind of like, thank you so much for this meeting. It's really insightful and really like enlightening about a lot of things, because I know a lot about the history of slavery, but my expertise is actually the history of the witch trials. And she was like, oh, I should tell you about sometime about this little connection that I think exists. And I was like, oh no, you can just tell me now. I've got time. um, and so when this opportunity came up, and it's the week of Halloween, so I decided, or Jeanne decided rather, to invite me in and kind of tell the spooky part of the story of the infamous quote unquote witch of Beverly, who was accused, tried, and convicted for witchcraft in 1692, but was never executed for it. But as we find out and what we'll talk about, is 1692 is not the first time she had been accused of practicing witchcraft or found herself before the courts. So I would love to tell you all about her. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So Dorcas Hoar of Beverly. Hoar, I will say at the beginning, means frost, basically. It is a very unfortunate name nowadays for us, but back then it would have been totally normal. She was born in 1635 in Beverly to a man named John Galley and a woman named Florence Isabella Ingham Galley. They were both born around 1605 in Lancashire, England. They immigrated to Massachusetts in the 1630s. I believe, from what I've researched, they actually settled in Salem first and then moved to Beverly, or at least John settled in Salem first and then moved to Beverly. On October 6th, 1635, John was fined 20 shillings for knowing his wife carnally before marriage. So the court likely knew this because Dorcas was probably born less than 9 months after their wedding date, as many people are kind of caught in that way in the colonial period. So in a way, I guess you could say that from the moment of her birth, she is surrounded by controversy. They end up having 2 more daughters as well that don't have as much controversy around them. Mary, who later becomes Mary Ross, and then Elizabeth, who later becomes Elizabeth Trask, and then Elizabeth Giles after that. So not much is really known about Dorcas's early life, actually. She married William Hoare, who was a fisherman, by 1655, and then they went on to have 8 children together. So they had Samuel, Simon, William Jr., Elizabeth, who went by Betty, who marries Jonas Johnson, Mary, who marries Samuel Harris, Tabitha, who goes by Tabby, who marries Leonard Slew, who we'll talk a lot more about later, or Jeanne will. Annis, who goes by Nancy, who marries John King Jr., and then Joanna, who I'm not sure who exactly she marries, but in 1710 she is referred to as Joanna Green in a restitution request that I'll be talking a little bit more. Quite scandalous. In 1660, 5 years after their marriage, William Hoare was charged with suffering tippling at his house, which basically just means like excessive drinking. He got really, really drunk at his house. But as you can see, the charge was dismissed for lack of evidence. However, 2 years after that, he was presented again in court for suffering tippling again by those who came to keep Christmas there. So as you can see pictured, I have a 1659 notice here about the ban on Christmas in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. because the Puritans felt that Christmas was a pagan holiday and it was of Satan and we shouldn't be doing anything for it. You can even see on the image it says satanical practices are hereby forbidden. So the fact that they were practicing Christmas, or at least inviting people over and keeping Christmas, is a little bit out of what the Puritans were supposed to be doing. I also feel the need to say, even though I know that you're all very smart, Dorcas Hoar and William Hoar lived in the same house. So if William Hoar is being brought in for suffering, tippling, and keeping Christmas, Dorcas is probably doing the same thing. It could also suggest potentially an illegal tavern-like situation, though they were never charged for operating an illegal tavern like some other people in the area, like Sarah and Edward Bishop. I wouldn't be surprised if the Hoars didn't make any money from these gatherings, but again, that's just speculation. I have no real evidence of any of that stuff. Now on to the juicy, juicy stuff, right? So around 1670, Reverend John Hill of Beverly, who is like, he's very popular in Beverly. If you ever come to Beverly, you'll hear a lot about him, I'm sure. He was the first ordained minister, and he actually was responsible, or partly responsible, for helping the town actually separate from Salem and become Beverly itself. And in 1670, he hears stories that Dorcas Hoar is telling fortunes and has a book of palmistry. So here I have pictured a book from 1651, and it is called The Book of Palmistry and Physiognomy, being brief introductions, both natural, pleasant, and delectable, unto the art of chiromancy, or manual divination, or physiognomy, with circumstances upon the faces of the signs, also canons or rules upon diseases or sickness, whereunto is also annexed as well the artificial as natural astrology within the nature of planets. I think the most terrifying thing of this whole presentation is how long that title is. It was written in Latin originally by John Jeanne, and then it was translated into English by Fabian Withers, and this is the 1651 edition. This might not be the one that she had, but this is one that was circulating during that time period, and it may have been similar to the one that she had. According to Reverend Hale and his reports, she claimed to have told her own fortune, saying that she would live very poorly while her husband was alive, but would live better after his death, although she later claims that she never told that fortune herself. Someone else had told it to her. There was a sailor that was on a ship that told her this whole future, that she was going to live better after her husband died. But she definitely said it quite a lot, probably when she was frustrated with her husband, I would guess. Other people also came forward as well, saying that she had told their fortunes, sometimes for a fee, sometimes for not, it seems. So there was a man named Edward Hooper who said that Dorcas told him that after a farm accident that he'd be better before the week was out. Joseph Morgan said that Dorcas predicted that he would die before his wife, and then his eldest daughter would not live to be a woman because of veins around her eyes. And Reverend Hale also mentions later she told the fortune of Mr. Corning that his wife would die before him due to a streak that was within her eye, and that had actually come to pass. So today I know fortune telling like kind of seems harmless. I live in Salem, who doesn't read palms and like pull tarot cards, right? But to the Puritans, this was considered magic, and all magic was of the work of the devil. So she was willingly talking about to everybody how she was practicing magic in this very extremely religious, small Puritan town. According to Hale's later testimony, which I have pictured here, apologies for the handwriting. Reverend Hale has the worst handwriting to transcribe. But when he confronted her, Dorcas repented, saying that she had only borrowed the book and she didn't understand that it was evil. And he wrote, which I have highlighted here, but telling her that it was an evil book and an evil art. And then she renounced it, and he had great charity for her for several years after that, until the events of 1678. So in 1678, there were multiple things that happened that come to light, which caused one of our former volunteers, Ed Brown, who has since passed away, but he called Dorcas Hoar the mafia boss of Beverly. I affectionately like to refer to her as the godmother, so that's what I will be kind of referring to her as we go through. But first, I need to tell you about Margaret Lord. So in March of 1678, a 17-year-old indentured servant of Reverend Hale named Margaret Lord ran away from the Hale household. The next day, she was captured and she was returned. And when she was returned, she had a pack full of things that she had stolen from the Hale household and 40 shillings. The day after she was caught and brought back, Dorcas actually comes to Reverend Hale's house and says basically something to the effect of, have mercy on Margaret. You can't blame her for the things that she did while she was sleepwalking. And Reverend Hale's like, she didn't steal all this stuff over the last year and 40 shillings and run away while she was sleepwalking. Like, that's just not how that works. So he actually begins building up a case against Margaret, which was presented in the quarterly courts on June 28th of that year, 1678. And what this revealed is that she was a menace. She threw rocks into wells that had just been cleared. She stole items from the Hales and their guests, sometimes literally hiding under people's beds, waiting for them to fall asleep to then reach into their pockets and steal their belongings. She told Mrs. Hale that she had lost the key to the cellar. She hadn't lost it at all. She just wanted an extra key so that she can steal a lot of things from it. She threatened to burn down houses. She threatened to steal Reverend Hale's gun and shoot people with it. She threatened to kill people. In short, she was terrifying. So, why am I mentioning her in a presentation about Dorcas Hoar, other than the fact that Halloween is in a couple days and this is the perfect time to talk about homicidal teenagers? Because in the course of Reverend Hale's investigation against Margaret Lord, we see the focus actually shift, and it basically becomes a case of Dorcas Hoar and her children. So what comes to light is that basically almost everything that Margaret stole, she would bring to the Hoar family. Usually it was brought directly to Dorcas, but some items were later found in Mary Harris's home, who was Dorcas's daughter. Tabitha and Nancy Hoar often came to collect these stolen goods, sometimes up to 2 times a day. And when they would come, they would often be like, oh, my mother wants XYZ. Or after taking it, they'd come back and be like, oh, Goody Hoar thanks you for, whatever they took, the peas or the cheese or the candles or whatever. There were multiple occasions where Margaret and Nancy were singing and dancing together at Reverend Hale's house while everyone was supposed to be at service or at a funeral in one point. Opinions on dancing among Puritans were mixed, so it's hard to know if like Reverend Hale specifically was against that, at least from my research. However, the witness that brings this up does say that he heard them say, "The Lord knows what we're doing, and may the Lord have mercy on us." Ha 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 ha. So it's unclear whether they're like joking and they're screaming for the Lord to have mercy on them while they're singing and dancing was from singing and dancing, or if it was from the thefts that they were doing. Regardless, they knew that they weren't doing the right thing in Beverly during this time period. Reverend Hale's son, Robert, also testified that he heard Margaret on multiple occasions call Nancy sister and call Dorcas mother. Margaret would also frequently also go to Betty Johnson's house, who was the daughter of Dorcas, for what he called merry bouts. And then more people start coming forward offering testimony against Dorcas and her children. So one guy comes forward and says, she's been my neighbor for 20 years. And for the past 20 years, all these little things have gone missing. And I always suspected that it was Dorcas, but I couldn't prove that it was Dorcas. But now that everyone else is saying these things, obviously it must have been Dorcas or her children. Roger Conant, who is the patriarch of Beverly and Salem and a few other towns, says that Mary and Betty came to his door asking for apples, and when he went to retrieve them, when he came back, they were gone, and so was a bolt of canvas that was by the door. Another guy said that he had a barrel of oil stolen, and soon after, William and Dorcas are then selling oil by the jar. She was confronted, Dorcas was confronted and asked if she was aware of this confederacy between Margaret and her children, and how it was possible that they could use so many bushels of malt, wheat, and sugar when they lived in such a small house with but one fire. Which, from that, tells us just how small William and Dorcas's home was, where all of their children were living before they married. Dorcas responded that she had no idea that the goods were stolen. She said that she thought many of the things had been purchased, and the things that they knew came from Reverend Hale's house. Well, those were gifts that were given to us by Mrs. Hale, and it's not our fault if she can't keep track of what she gives away in charity. But the case then does take a very dark turn, unfortunately. Rebecca Hale Jr., who was Reverend Hale's daughter, explained why she hadn't told anything about this, even though she knew literally everything that was happening. And she said that Margaret Lord threatened to burn her or kill her if she spoke. Margaret held her over a well, threatened to throw her in, and once even lowered her in the basket to the bottom of the well. Margaret said that she had a rope to hang Rebecca with. And when Rebecca said, "You can't kill me because I've heard stories that they actually catch child murderers," Margaret replied, basically, "That's just in England, babe. Like, they're never going to find me. And they would never be able to know it was you anyway, because I'm just going to burn your body after I kill you." Again, she was terrifying. She also threatened multiple times to kill Mrs. Hale, and said that she had a book that she could call the devil to kill Rebecca or any other servant in the Hale house, specifically Sarah, if they told. So 14 years later, during Reverend Hale's 1692 testimony, I'm going to kind of go on this weird like question that I have right now about this, because testimonies and records aren't really fully lining up. So this is kind of like a weird thing that I'm going to continue to look into. So 14 years later, during Reverend Hale's testimony in 1692 against Dorcas Hoar, he recounted that Rebecca said that it was actually Dorcas who had this book. Reverend Hale recalls that Rebecca told him that Dorcas was a witch and had a book that could tell her everything that Rebecca did, and if she told anyone about the stealing, that Dorcas would raise the devil to kill her. He recalls that he doesn't remember if it was like Dorcas that told her that or someone else told her that Dorcas would do that. But regardless, she was terrified of Dorcas and this book that she apparently had. And when he asked her if she had seen the book, she said that she did. It was about the size of a children's grammar book. It was full of streaks and pictures. And when she was talking about this, he was reminded of this book of palmistry that she had like 7 years before, and went and asked a couple people if they had ever seen the book. And one man, Thomas Tuck, said that he had, that it was about the size of a children's grammar book and it was full of streaks and pictures. And when William Hoare was confronted about it, when Reverend Hale went to confront him, he said the book belonged to a man named John Sampson and that Dorcas had returned it years ago after Reverend Hale had confronted her about it. She hadn't done anything like that in years and years and years. And John Sampson corroborated this. He said, "Yes, at one point we did have this book when I was living with Dorcas, but I sold it a super long time ago. So it's not even in Beverly anymore. It's in Casco Bay." So when read together, these accounts are like oddly inconsistent, because in 1692, when Reverend Hale is making this statement, Rebecca has already been dead for many, many years, but he's parroting these words that she said herself during the earlier during the 1678 and 1679 issues that were going on. Now it's possible that maybe Rebecca like orally told Reverend Hale that she was a witch and all of these things that were happening, but on record what we have don't really like fully line up. And because it had been so many years in between, I'm curious if these stories were kind of conflated or if Dorcas really did have these things. But like in the 1678 documents, there are no records of Dorcas being a witch. And yet all of this stuff is used against her in 1692, in addition to her palmistry things that she did in the early 1670s. And apparently Rebecca was terrified of the Hoare family until the day that she died. Regardless, in the end, Margaret Lord, Dorcas Hoar, and her children, Mary, Betty, and Nancy, were all charged with theft. Dorcas was additionally charged with receiving stolen goods. Margaret was never actually fully convicted of any of these things, or she never faced any consequences rather for any of these things, because she fled. Apparently she hid in Mary Harris's barn, who was Dorcas's daughter, when the constable came to arrest her, and then she fled. I haven't been able to find her. I've been looking for her, but I'm sure when I do, there will be terrifying stories in her wake, because that girl is scary. But Dorcas and her three daughters were fined very minorly, but nothing further really came of the charges. However, I think that they took personal offense to a lot of that, because in 1679, Dorcas may or may not have been involved in this, I will say, but in 1679, they're brought to court again. Eyewitness accounts say that he saw Betty Johnson, one of Dorcas Hoar's daughters, luring the cows that belonged to Reverend Hale into her backyard, and then saw Nancy, Simon, Dorcas's son, and Betty Johnson's children with clubs and sticks striking at the cow until it collapsed. The cow later died, and when they went to butcher it, they saw that she was very bruised, which then led them to kind of investigate all of that. So the court handed down multiple sentences to the Hoar children and the Hoar grandchildren. Betty Johnson was fined £3, and Nancy and Simon were both sentenced to be whipped 6 times by the constable with a birch rod. Although I think that instead they opted to ask for a fine, because in 1682 there is a clerk record that says that they paid £22, 10 shillings, and 3 pence instead of receiving the punishment, it would believe. So to put this into perspective, how much £22 was for the Hoar family, when William Hoars died and his estate was probated in 1696, his entire estate was only valued at £25. So this fine was an extraordinary financial burden to the family that already was in debt. And we know that they're in debt because when William Hoare dies, his estate's only worth £25 and he owes over £30 in debt. So they have to sell everything in an attempt to pay off all of this debt. And yet, in 1680, with all of these things happening, William Hoare becomes a sexton of the church. I will say the image that I have here has nothing to do with Dorcas Hoar, has nothing to do with William Hoare. It's called the Goblin and the Sexton, and I just love it, which is why I included it in here. But it has nothing to do with the Hoare case, other than the fact that it's a little bit spooky. But the sexton is a position in the church that carries multiple responsibilities. They have to keep the keys to the meeting house. They sweep the meeting house. They ring the bell for curfew at night. They ring the bell when it's time for morning and afternoon service on Sundays, and they turn the hourglass for the ministers to keep track of how long their sermons go, so that they keep it within an hour, but also so that they keep it at an hour, because if the sermons don't go long enough, from what I've researched, like they kind of would be very offended. The role of sexton is selected by the entire town, not just the church, but I'd find it really hard to believe that William could have been given this position without the approval of John Hale. And I find it interesting that after all of these things had happened in the previous 2 years, they're now given this like pretty prestigious position, or at least, given this position within the church. Maybe Reverend Hale did it to keep them close, and keep a closer eye on them. But I think that it may have been almost a way of poor relief, potentially, because a lot of the items that were stolen from the people in the town, like, yeah, there were pearls and gold and, jewels and stuff like that. But for the most part, it was food that was stolen and brought to Dorcas and her children. And part of the salary of a sexton was actually to receive like a peck of corn from each house. At least they were supposed to receive a peck of corn from each house. So I am kind of curious if they were providing something for the Hoare family so that they didn't need to resort to stealing anymore. And we don't see anything on record of them resorting to theft or anything like that moving forward. In 1691, William Hoare dies. It's either the end of 1691 or the beginning of 1692. He dies quite suddenly. I couldn't find a cause of death, just that he died quite suddenly. In colonial times, when someone dies kind of out of the blue, or if there's a suspected murder or anything like that, they will put like a jury together to examine the body and examine the evidence and determine the cause of death. When this jury was put together and they went to William and Dorcas's home, Dorcas was very upset. She was screaming at the men to leave, and when they wouldn't leave, she apparently, multiple people corroborated, saying, "What, do you think I killed my husband or something?" And she was very, very upset, and she had to be calmed down for them to kind of proceed with all of that. And then later on, we have the beginning of the 1692 crisis. So at the beginning of 1692, in what was then Salem Village, now Danvers, many of you probably know, so I'll go through this very quickly. 2 young girls named Abigail Williams and Betty Paris begin exhibiting very strange behavior. They start barking like dogs. They're hiding under furniture. They're saying that all of these people in these like ghostly, spectral, unseen forms are harming them. The local minister, Reverend Samuel Paris, who was their father and uncle, and Reverend John Hale of Beverly both agreed that the girls were bewitched. This was confirmed by a doctor who examined the girls. Because witchcraft was so real, these girls were diagnosed with being bewitched. Like, witchcraft was such a reality, it was a medical diagnosis to be bewitched. And then as the news spread, other girls in the community began showing similar symptoms and began being known as the afflicted girls of Salem. By February 29th, of 1692, the first formal accusations of witchcraft were made. And on April 30th of 1692, a warrant for the arrest of Dorcas Hoar and others are issued to George Herrick, who was the Marshal of Essex County. 2 days later, Dorcas is brought into the meeting house where preliminary examinations were conducted by John Hathorne and John Corwin, who were magistrates at the time, but would later see Dorcas again during her trial, of which they were judges of. During her examination, the afflicted girls made several accusations against her. They said that Dorcas's specter appeared and harmed them, that Abigail Williams, who accused the first three women, claimed that Dorcas was actually the first witch that she had ever seen. They said that Dorcas murdered her husband by choking him. They said that the entire time that she was talking, the devil was whispering in her ear. They claimed that she had black cats that were familiars that she suckled, that a bird flew into her back, that there were flies around her, and all of these were all demons in disguise. And at one point, Dorcas gets so frustrated that she turns towards the girls and she says, "Someone will rub your ears shortly." And then the girls fall into fits. And when she was asked why she would say such a thing and why she would harm the girls right in front of everyone, she explained that she simply just meant that God would bring everything to light and she would be proven innocent. Pretty much a lot of the things that I've already told you come from the testimonies of 1692. The only other one that I will mention comes from the Balch family. So David Balch, who was a son of Benjamin Balch, in the Balch house that Historic Beverly owns, that Jeanne mentioned very briefly at the beginning, he claimed to see the ghostly specters of witches standing at the end of his bed. And when he was asked who these women were that were trying to hurt him, he names Sarah Wilds, her daughter, who would have been her actual stepdaughter, Sarah Bishop, an unknown woman from Marblehead, who was likely Wilmot Red, who was the only woman from Marblehead who was accused, and Dorcas Hoar. All of this testimony was used against Dorcas, and she was found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to be executed on September 22nd of 1692. However, the night before her scheduled execution, she did something that no one else had done. She confessed after being convicted. So she told her jailer, oh, I'm sorry, that was the Balch House one. So she told her jailer that she was ready to confess. They brought in Reverend Hale and others who advised her and then wrote this petition on her behalf, which gave her a 30-day reprieve. She was still supposed to be executed, but the executions ended. So she actually survived the witch trials because of this. So brief aftermath, we know very little of it. I guess ultimately the question is, was she a witch? No, she was not. Now, was she maybe practicing things that at the time would have been considered witchcraft related? Maybe. Was she maybe doing things that were looked down upon, like practicing Christmas? Maybe. There was also this account that was written by D. Lawson, which said that she had a 4'7" elf lock, which is like old English magic. It's basically like a long dreadlock that they would have. So her hair was short except for this 4'7" lock that she had. And they ordered it to be cut. And when they ordered it to be cut, she said she was told if she ever to cut it off, her mother had told her that she would die or be sick, and they cut it off anyway. Was she maybe doing things that would have been looked down upon? Yes, but to think about it during that time period, a witch was someone who was selling their soul to the devil and stepping out of their body in this ghostly, invisible form and causing chaos and working with demons, and like that didn't exist. There was nobody who was doing that. Were there maybe people who were doing things that were looked down upon? Yes, and Dorcas is definitely doing that. I like to say Dorcas was the only person that I've researched that I'm not surprised was accused, but I really don't think anyone should have been accused, really, of it. So I apologize for this very faint image. I tried to put a filter on it and it just didn't work very well. But in May of 1693, she's released from prison. She has all of these charges, which are here, that she has to pay. So the charges that she has to pay mixed with the cost of her husband's probate, she has no money at the end of it. In 1699, her son-in-law, John King Jr., kind of puts a petition to the town to receive money to take care of her. He receives £4 a year for the next 5 years. In 1704, he does another one where he receives £5 per year. And then there's for the next 3 years, and then there's not one that comes in 1707. So it's assumed that she died sometime between 1704 and 1707. A lot of things on the internet say 1711. I have no idea where that came from, because this restitution request that was put in place by her children after her death lists her as deceased. So that 1710 restitution also names Dorcas's children as the beneficiaries, including Tabitha Slew and her 3 children. So I think that this case really illustrates how like class, status, connections, like how all of that kind of factors in to a lot of this. What's interesting as we transition into Jeanne's topic is oftentimes witchcraft cases are speculative, but what's interesting in this case is everything that we know between what Jeanne's about to talk about in this, we actually know about the witch trials. The next part is going to be completely speculative. So I'm going to pass that over to Jeanne now.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I think I want to go back. Let's see. Get this going again. All right. Again, we are in Essex County, and this is Beverly, and this is the hamlet of Ipswich. And it's right, 1A, what's called now the 1A, was the main road that would go from Ipswich down through Beverly to the ocean. And this is the road that John Whipple's living on, just to give you an idea of really how close they are together. All right, Tabitha. We don't know when Tabitha was born, but we do know from the early trial records that Tabitha marries a man named Leonard Slew. And that's about 1677. So Leonard Slew is also a fisherman, and a very poor one, it appears. And fishermen didn't own their boats. Usually someone else would own the boat, and he would, fishermen would be responsible for catching the fish, but they weren't wealthy enough to actually own their own boats. Now, Tabitha is also accused of stealing goods from the neighbors and from Reverend Hale, but she's, as Krystina said, she's not, there seems to be no judgment against her. We do know that from various different records, not church records, and I think that's really important. It's not in the church records, it shows up later, that she had 5 children, and the 2 oldest are Leonard and Rachel, Leonard being named after his father. And we know that they're not church records because Tabitha has not been baptized into the church. And she is, I think, Tabitha is baptized in 1695. That does show up in the church records, which is quite late. I mean, for someone who's probably by this point, at least in her 40s. And there seems to be, and we were talking about this, Krystina and I, a slew of baptisms that are kind of taking place in 1695. And we're speculating that perhaps Jonathan Hale, after the witch trials have settled, and he's actually, I think, writing it, this one is a history of the witch trials. He's kind of trying to bring the church back. He's trying to bring things back to life and bring in these people who have these poor reputations, who are not baptized and not members of the church, because her brother, William's wife, is baptized in that same year. And then the next year, William and Sarah's 4 children are baptized all at once. And so it's a sign that really, I think that there are a lot of things going on that Jonathan Hale is trying to pull his church back together. But Tabitha moves to Maine around 1700, and there are various Maine records that tell us that they have acquired some land. We don't know how, but not for very long. What they're doing is acquiring the land and then selling it, or acquiring it. And at one point, he sells a couple of acres of land for a heifer, but they have taken their younger children with them. And we know this because in 1703, there is a conflict, a lethal conflict with the Native Americans in the area, and 23 people are killed, including Tabitha and her husband Leonard and their 3 children. We know Leonard has been moving back and forth, again, because of the Maine records about property transfer, to Beverly and Salem, and then up to Maine. So they're still in touch, and they still may be in touch with their two older children who seem to have been left in Beverly. In 1703, Leonard Slew Jr. marries a woman, Abigail Johnson. And still, Rachel, his sister, is called churched upon profession. Now, this would mean that she's probably been baptized. What she's done is stand up in church and profess that she has had an experience of her sinfulness and her need to rely on God's grace, and that she has accepted the grace of Christ. And this is enough to let her be church. And it's probably means that she's become a member of the church or has been baptized in it. And that's occurring by 1707. Now, remember, Leonard and Rachel, Tabitha has got married in 1677. So Rachel is under 30, but may not be too many years under 30. Now, Leonard and Abigail there's only one child that is recognized as being baptized, and that's in 1710, Samuel Slew. There is a record of, in 1714, that they have another child who dies. The child's not named. There's no indication that the child had been baptized in the church. Now, Leonard has not been baptized into the church nor accepted into the church. So we believe that Reverend Hale is working hard to try to bring this disreputable family into the church, and his successor is doing the same. In 1711, now this is to be, wrong way. There we go. 1711, this is Samuel Slew has been born. This is before the second child of Leonard and Abigail they filed for the reverse attenders. There's an act passed by the state basically saying, all right, we've gotten all these petitions from the various families of the victims. We will recompense them for their costs. Now, their costs include things like food that they ate in jail, what the expenses that the sheriff had, keeping them in jail, their whole list of things that they are applying for. The state has agreed to reimburse people for, because they've had to pay for this. The travel, a lot of the victims have been transferred to the Boston jail. So the descendants the families are asking for recompense for the trips into Boston. That when the victims are brought back for trial, then they have to pay that cost as well. Nothing is covered by the state. Everything has to be paid for by the families. And now the state says, all right, so maybe we weren't quite right about all that, and we'll reimburse you for some of those costs. And there's a long list. Leonard and Rachel apply for Tabitha's portion. Now, Tabitha, there's an application for it, and then there's the actual payment for it. And between that time, Tabitha has died. This perhaps is where the 1711 figure comes from, because we really believe that Tabitha has died probably around 1707 when Rachel is church. So maybe Rachel's gotten a little bit of religion at this point. But when the reimbursement is agreed to by the state, and they receive 21 pounds for the cost, their descendants do. Now, there are other descendants from Dorcas, so they have to split this money, and particularly the family that was taking care of Dorcas, their son William. So they don't get very much. We don't know exactly how much, but they do sign that they have received a portion of what's due, what was Tabitha's portion. So in 1726, there's another document that shows up where we see Leonard and Rachel mentioned. And again, because they're not appearing in church records, these are about the only records we have of their existence. And they are selling their shares in William Hoar's common. William Hoar, remember, is Dorcas Hoar's father. And he was accepted as a freeman late in life. Freeman gives him certain rights. It makes him a member of the church. It also gives him a share of the common land. So that share is passed down to his children and to his grandchildren. A portion of that share would have been passed to Tabitha, who has died, but so Leonard and Rachel are due. But And in 1726, one of the Beverly wealthier men is buying up all of these common land shores. He wants to pull all this land together and farm it. So there's a long document, all of these children and grandchildren, and Leonard and Rachel are mentioned on there. They get very little, a couple of pounds, because their sliver is just that much smaller. But Leonard Slew becomes a sextant in 1727. So we're fairly certain that they're very poor at this point. And again, being a sextant was kind of the poor relief. Give them a job. You have to work for what we give you. So you have to work for this salary that we're going to pay the sextant, mainly in what's called country pay, which is meaning every family has to show up with a peck of corn. Whether they do or not, it's probably up to Leonard to go out there and knock on people's doors and say, you haven't given me my peck of corn yet. So it's not a real steady income. Then we have the last records of Leonard and Abigail and Rachel. Rachel dies in 1734, and Abigail dies 4 years later in 1738. Leonard Slew, on probably his deathbed, is accepted finally into the church. So I guess he feels he's facing eternity, and it's time to get his soul right with God. And he dies in 1744. These are the last mentions. Their son Samuel has moved to Salem, married a woman there, and is not showing up in the records anymore. So there are no more records that we have found, which is not to say we haven't, there isn't something we haven't found out there, but there are no more records that we've found of the Slew family. And these are the only Slew families that I have found in all of Essex County. So either they've moved out of state, the way Tabitha and her husband Leonard did, or there are just no more of them. These are important dates because I come along in 1765, or the first case, Jenny Slew comes along in 1765. So this is about 20 years after Leonard has died. And she files suit against John Whipple. And she says, Jenny Slew of Ipswich in the county of Essex, spinster, a plea of trespass against John Whipple. And there's this long statement about how he's grabbed her on this particular day in Ipswich with force and arms and took her and kept her in servitude as a slave and has restrained her of her liberty from that time to this day without any lawful right or authority to do so. Now, this in the past has been read by historians as meaning she was free until somehow John Whipple managed to enslave her, which is not true. This is a common phrase. If you heard my speech last spring, you know that this is a common phrase under common law. This is not a criminal case. This is a civil case. And she's suing for something, just as a man might trespass on another man's property, she's suing John Whipple for trespassing on her property. Well, if you're trespassing, there has to be a day that it occurred, and there has to be a length of time that it occurred in. The common law doesn't care that we're really talking about enslaving somebody. So the lawyer, when he writes out this writ to give to the court, has to come up with a date, and he just picks one. We don't know why this particular date. Maybe that's the day she decided she was going to go talk to the lawyer. It's not clear, but it isn't the case where she's saying, it isn't the case that this actually happened. It's just boilerplate language. And they all say something like this. But who's John Whipple? Well, John Whipple's a fairly reputable man in Ipswich Hamlet. He was born in 1695. Now, there are a lot of John Whipples, so I have to admit, okay, I can't 100% guarantee that this is the John Whipple, but everything fits. Okay, he's born in 1695. He marries Hannah Whipple. They have a series of sons, and then there's this long period where there's no children, and we don't know why. But then all of a sudden, 3 daughters show up. Bing, bing, bing. But in 1758, Hannah dies. It's possible that John Whipple remarried, and because there are when he dies in 1769, and this is 4 years later after Jenny Slew's lawsuit and everything, he dies, and there's a probated inventory in it, and the inventory lists that he has 3 minor sons. So there also lists something which I have seen in no other Whipple inventory, and that the probate lists a Negro bed and bed linens evaluated at 4 pounds. There is no Negro servant listed in the inventory. So at some point, he has had an enslaved person living in his house. And this is, I believe, and quite likely, was Jenny Slew's bed. The question is, why does she call herself Jenny Slew? And why is she suing after all this time? Why is she suing? Well, because obviously John Whipple's getting up there in years. He's born in 1695, and now we're talking 1765. So he's 70 at this point. And it's not uncommon when a man dies for his descendants, the people who are he bequeaths his goods to sell the Negro, the slave, the person who's been enslaved in the household. It's a way of cashing in. Basically, they want to cash in on this person. And this is an example of a man in Danvers whose executor of his will says, we've got all these things to be sold. And Krystina's found other examples of these ads where they not only mention a Negro woman or a Negro man to be sold, but also a cow or a heifer or this is just part of his property. And the descendants are cashing in. So Jenny's got some reason by 1765 to be concerned that if John Whipple is getting up there in years and he dies, then she is likely to be sold by his widow, particularly if she's a younger woman. Although there's no widow mentioned in the probate inventory either. So it's not real clear. And this is the problem. We start getting these holes, very, very common. There are other things she could have done to gain her freedom. She could have run away. Running away is something generally mostly men did because they had the opportunity to look for work on ships, to keep running, to sell things in Boston, to move into Boston. It's much harder for a woman to do something like that. So, and then there are also people going around buying up slaves. These are slave traders, basically. This happens starting in the 1760s, definitely by the 1770s. When the economy gets poor, then slave traders come in and people can cash in on their enslaved people and sell them. So she doesn't have a good alternative in terms of getting her freedom. She doesn't have, and she's got some reasons to be afraid that if Whipple dies before she gets her freedom, that she's going to be sold to who knows who and be forced to go who knows where. So she files suit and claiming she's just been illegally enslaved. And Whipple's response is, there's no such person in nature as Jenny Slew, aforesaid spinster. And again, historians in the past kind of misread this. Common law, you have to identify yourself as having a particular class. And white women only had 2 classes. They were either unmarried, in which case they're called a spinster, or they're widowed. They aren't ever identified as married because married women could not file suit in court for anything. Only their husbands could file suit for them under the laws of coverture. So there are only 2 identifications for women, and that's spinster, sometimes called single woman, and widow. So she's called herself a spinster. And Whipple's response is, she is a married woman. Is she? Well, in 1747, and this is 3 years after Leonard Slew has died, there is a Jane Sleigh listed in the Ipswich Vital Records as having married a Caesar, who is a servant, that means an enslaved person, of Stephen Emerson. So she very like this is Jenny Slew, is my argument. This spellings are very dubious, and Slew is spelled in a variety of ways. And I think this is Jenny Slew, and I think she did marry Caesar. Caesar is enslaved by Stephen Emerson, and Stephen Emerson, a few years later, moves to New Hampshire and takes Caesar with him. We don't know what happened to them, but I suspect this is the end. They've been separated because of slavery, and Jenny Slew now considers herself a single woman. So the defense that Whipple has given that there's no such thing as Jenny Slew spinster is thrown out. No, you can't count that. Okay, she is a spinster, so her writ is good. There is a trial, and 2 witnesses are subpoenaed for this trial. Both of them, Caleb Balch and Anthony Wood, are elderly men, both from Beverly. And Balch and Wood are, particularly Balch, is a very respected name in Beverly. So these are not ordinary people. These are well-respected people. Court records, if you recall from my talk last spring, are not kept for the purposes of recording what was said or whose attorney was whose or why someone was called to come in and be a witness or to be subpoenaed and give a deposition. These records are kept so that these 2 people are recompensed for their traveling to the trial. So they apply for and get a small payment for the time and effort it took to come to trial. And the clerk is keeping a list so the clerk knows who to pay and who to charge for when the case is settled. The case is settled in this case for Whipple. So for whatever reason, these witnesses came, it's not clear that the jury really bought into it. Or perhaps, and I think it's quite likely, the jury is simply supporting a property owner. Whipple's well-known, well-respected, and the jury members are all elected to be on the jury. They are all themselves fairly respectable people from their towns. Serving on a jury was kind of often your first public job. So they're just going to file for the owner. Now, Jenny Slew has the right to appeal, and she does immediately, appeals to the Superior Court of Judicature. In those days, this isn't the case of, oh, this was the principle that you violated in my trial, and I want the Superior Court to rule on this principle. No, you have a brand new trial all over again. So in November 1766 is a new trial, and all the records from the first trial are transferred up to the Superior Court, which is why we have them. If they had not appealed, these records would have just been discarded by the clerk. So we also have something else, something very special, which is John Adams is attending Superior Court. He's there because he's a lawyer and he has also cases, but he's attending this particular trial because he's interested in it. It's unusual. He has never seen one before. He writes in his diary, I've never seen one. I've heard they've had them. I'm kind of interested in it. He's not interested really in the facts of the case. He's not interested in the art. What he's interested in are the principles because he's trying to learn more about law. So he writes a very short sentence saying that she's commonly reputed to be the child of Betty Slew, a white woman by a Negro man. Who is Betty Slew? And I don't think there is a Betty Slew. I think that he's not really paying close attention, and he's writing quick notes to himself, which are then transcribed later. We don't have these original notes. They're transcribed later, about 10 years later, by one of the clerks working for another lawyer. And so this is coming to us now even secondhand or third hand at this point. But he does note that Benjamin Kent, who is Slew's attorney, says, well, if she's his slave, where's the bill of sale? Where's some record that he has that he legally has the right to enslave Jenny Slew? And Gridley, Whipple's attorney, argues, well, she was never free. There's no freedom for her to have been trespassed upon by Whipple because she's never been in possession of her liberty. She's been out of possession for 50 years. 50 years. Okay, I do my math. That means she was born sometime around 1765 or 1715 because she originally files in 1765. So going back, looking at, there are 3 more witnesses that are brought in. Hannah Dodge, another well-respected name, married to a deacon, born a Raymond, another high status in Beverly. Sarah Herrick, another big name. She's married to a Herrick. She's also born a Raymond, and Jonathan Hart. And I looked these people up. These are all elderly people. And what age were they in 1715? They were young adults. except for Jonathan Hart, who was a child, but the others are old enough to have been there when Jenny Slew was born. So the question is, why are these people brought in? And I don't think it's reasonable to think that John Whipple brought them in. Why would he bring in all of these people that to testify? Why would they even come? These are the people who would have been there in Beverly, who would have known that Jenny Slew's mother was white and that she had given birth to a child of color. So I believe, and I think this is a reasonable assumption, that they have been called in to testify for Jenny Slew that her mother was indeed white. And they're respectable people, so I think that we can also assume that they are not there because they're there to help out Jenny. It's just that they know what happened. And testifying, they may have testified, they may have written out a deposition, although there's no written depositions that were kept. But they are there to confirm her claim that her mother was white. What are the laws in Massachusetts at the time? At the time, the law is very ambiguous. Massachusetts has had the first law for enslavement way back in the middle 1600s, but it was kind of loosely written. They tightened it up a little bit, but it is nothing like the laws that were developed in the South. So there's really no specific law that says you're a child born of an enslaved woman is a slave, a child born of a white woman, even if the father is enslaved, doesn't mean the child is enslaved. But they have adopted this over time. It's become kind of the common way of doing things. Then why is Jenny Slew enslaved? Well, my theory is that, we'll get back to this in a second. Jenny Slew is enslaved because Rachel's given, it's probably Rachel. There's no other Slew woman of that age who could have given birth to a child. I don't think it was Leonard Slew's child who died unnamed, because he would not have been the father. And these 4 or 5 people who are coming up from Beverly are not coming up to testify that Leonard Slew was the father and the mother was Black, because she wins this case. Jenny Slew wins the second trial. And in the trial notes that Adams is keeping, the questions are raised. First of all, can a slave be legally married? And the answer is, well, not really, not enough. Is color a presumption of enslavement? In other words, does every person of color have to prove that they're free because we can just assume that they're enslaved? And the answer to that is debated amongst the justices clearly. And finally, does enslavement follow the mother's status? So I believe that the jury has ruled that since that's the common practice, if Jenny Slew's mother is Rachel Slew or another Slew woman, and there's only Rachel who could possibly be the mother, then Jenny Slew is entitled to be free. There are debates obviously going back and forth about this. Justice Oliver, one of the 3 justices in the case, says this is really a contest between liberty and property, both of great consequence, but liberty the most important of the 2. The jury hears this, that this is a jury by 1765 is probably starting to be concerned about slavery and starting to be concerned that the law or the common practice is followed. And they're presented with a case where everyone accepts that if the mother is a slave, then the child is a slave. And if the mother is white, then the child is not enslaved. Now, you're not supposed to have sexual relations, Blacks and whites together. There is a law against that. But things happen, these things happen. There's no evidence that I have found of anyone being accused of giving birth to a bastard child. Certainly, Rachel Slew is not accused of that. There are no criminal records for this. There were occasionally in the past, but they're not from Beverly and they're not anybody named Slew or Hoar for that matter. So I suspect that this is what's happened, that when Rachel gave birth to Jenny, she's poor, she's disreputable, and as Krystina said, everybody goes, what would you expect of this family? They're already, we all know they're kind of witchy, we all know they're kind of thieves, we all know this is a low-class family. And so what would you expect? Of course, we don't really know if this is the case, how this child came to be, what the sexual relationship was. There's numerous kinds of suppositions what can make about it. It could have been a consensual, it could have been non-consensual. It could have been for money. It could have been for food that the enslaved person might have provided under the table, so to speak, or under the bed to Rachel. So it's not real clear. Rachel should have been a good member of the church at this point, so this is not something she should be doing, but she's probably employed as a servant in somebody's house. And she's probably new. We know that the Balches are enslaved, so she's certainly not unacquainted with people and men of color. So however this happened, it's clear to the jury that Slew is right, that she has a white mother and a black father, and that Whipple is wrong to have enslaved her. And he's ordered to pay £4 in costs. We don't know if he actually paid it or not, but following this case, there are a slew of freedom suits, and I've talked about these. These are all Essex County. Most of them on the left-hand side, down to the Bristol versus John Osgood and Dandover, are based upon, down to Nancy Parker here, are based upon the status of the mother. Violet Howe provides proof that her mother and her grandmother were both free. Peter and Kate provide evidence that their mother was a Native American, and it is not legal at that time to enslave Native Americans. Edward Lewis is the son of Violet. Jude Hale also claims she's a mulatto, and therefore, she's not entitled to be enslaved. Whether exactly who her mother is, it's not clear. But all of these cases, after that, the cases start to turn, as I talked about last spring, and we get into more questions. And by 1775, all of those cases, the owner doesn't even show up in court. So there's a sea change going on in people's opinions about slavery, and the juries are getting, I believe, more and more uncomfortable, and the lawyers in particular are realizing they're going to lose this case. Any slave owner that tries to defend himself when his slave sues him is going to lose. And there's a judge much later on in the early 1800s who writes a history of slavery. And this is what he says: if you have a slave who is unhappy enough to sue you for his freedom, you might as well let him go, because you're not going to win the case, and your neighbors are not going to be happy with you keeping this unhappy person. So at this point, the slave owners have given up on thinking that they can go to court to defend their rights. It started with Jenny Slew versus John Whipple. In 1780, there's a new state constitution, which John Adams writes, and it has the preamble that declares all men are born free and equal and have the right. This is right from the Declaration of Independence. And in the early 1780s, there are the final freedom suits. These are often considered to be suits that were settled because of the newly ratified Massachusetts Constitution, although I've talked about that last spring. That's come under, it didn't end slavery, and we're not even sure that the jury ruled on that basis. But it's clear at this point, juries are not comfortable enforcing slavery in any way. The legislature considers abolishing slavery and goes back and forth on it, and never really gets around to it. But since you can't protect your property rights in people anymore, and since people can run away and the economy is doing so poorly, slavery ceases to be economically viable. So slavery pretty much comes to an end in Massachusetts, all starting with Jenny Slew. as I said, she got married in 1747. By 1771, there's another Jane, a free Negro, and I really believe this is Jenny Slew, who marries another enslaved man, Scipio, who's a servant of Samuel Potter. Now, there are no more records of anything Slew. The only thing I found in Ipswich was a Jane Staniford, a Negro woman who dies in 1794. Whether this is Jenny or not, I don't know. She'd be in her 80s. And generally, a lot of times you'll see if somebody that age dies, they'll note how old she is, but that's not true generally with women of color. So I don't have a good ending to my story as to what happened to Jenny Slew. But what we do have are an example, both Krystina and I believe, of the relationship between reputation locally, of caste, of your economic status, of your family, and slavery. The Hoars and Slews are poor, they're scrambling to survive, they're very disreputable, and before and after the witch hysteria, they're very poor, very disreputable, and scrambling to survive. Jenny Slew, and I do believe she is a member of this family, she's clearly of mixed race. She carries that skin color, and that was enough in those days. And she's known to be part of the Slew family, which I would argue that Jane Slew, record of her marriage, is that Jenny Slew's been carrying this name for quite some time, perhaps all of her life. Perhaps she's been recognized as a Slew all along. And that these elderly people coming up on their wagon. I always envision of them all sitting on a wagon being brought up to Ipswich to fill out their depositions or actually speak in court. They know who she is, and they know she's part of the Slew family, and John Whipple probably knows too. He should have probably just let it go when she initially sued him. It ended up costing him £4. And we know she didn't even get to take her bed with her when she left. Wherever she went, she may have stayed. She may have stayed for a while, but she's not listed in the inventory by 1769. So at this point, I think she has moved on. She's found work someplace else and then marries again. So that's our connection. And I often say, it's like, I've got the Slews and Hoars of Beverly up to this point, and I've got Jenny Slew up to this point, and we have a little gap here. And this is really the story of history. This is a common story where we have to look at what's going on at the time. We have to understand the circumstances and the context to say, yeah, this really fits together. So that's our story. Krystina, do you want to add something? Have I skipped anything or should have brought up something?
The only thing that you and I were kind of talking about that I find so fascinating and that I'm curious and want to look into more is Dorcas has a daughter that goes by Betty, and
Yes.
Jenny Slew is said to have been the daughter of Betty, right? And so I'm so curious if if Jenny is the daughter of Rachel, we see a history of family members being taken in by other members, of the Hoar family. And I'm so curious if potentially, if Jenny Slew is Rachel's daughter, she went and lived with Betty Johnson, who was Dorcas's daughter. And I'm just so curious because Betty was still alive she outlived Rachel Slew. So I'm just so curious, and that's something that I want to look into. And
I think it's well worth it. The one piece of evidence in the court records that I found is this document, and what it's doing there, I can't even tell you that, but it does say, it does mention an Elizabeth who would have been called Betty. She's using a last name of White, and she's a Negro servant, so she's enslaved. Why she has a white name, a last name, I'm not sure. But both of them, this record says that they were married to each other in 1754. Well, I'm not quite sure how that even applies, since Jenny Slew is acknowledged to be around 50 years old. So this actually could just be a stray document that made it slipped into the court records at some point over the 200 years that these things occurred at any time. Or it could be something that Whipple's attorney tried to slip in as, well, she's really the daughter of this Elizabeth White, who's a Negro servant, and then maybe John Adams, half listening to the facts, writes this down, commonly reported. One of those tantalizing questions that is going to keep Krystina and I going for quite some time. Who is this Betty? And was it Betty Johnson? I don't think Betty Johnson was young enough to have had a child, but on the other hand, she could have taken the child. She could have raised the child. So we're going to end it there. I can see we're reaching our end. So. All right.
Oh,
over to you, Dorothy.
Wow. I don't know. Is it fair if I start with my own question? Methodology. All I can say is wow. And typically I'm more of a written word person than a visual one. But the only way would be able to keep track of this would be to do some sort of diagram or draw all of this out, because writing it out in sentences, I would lose track of what I was doing. So, how did you keep track of?
Took us a long time is the answer. There's,
Mhm.
I mean, it's I think eventually we took a lot of notes, and I think that particular Krystina, you've done a great job making a family tree, trying to keep
Mm.
track of the Hoars and Slews, and particularly the Hoars, the Galleys and the Hoars, and who married who, and all of that. So in the end, that's what you do end up doing is
Mhm.
trying to, and it's a little easier for the white folks because a lot of their records do show up in the church records. And
Yeah.
as an example, Jenny Slew, let's say she is the daughter of Rachel Slew. There's no record of her birth. There's no record of anything. And her name is, she's got no family once Leonard dies. So
Mhm.
this is very true for people of color. They just kind of disappear, and you have to find little samples of them. And then it makes it very hard to make a chart because you got so many holes in your chart.
It's funny though because Dorcas's family, none of them are recorded. So like trying
No,
to connect all of that stuff, none of Dorcas's marriage is like they're not in the vital records. So you have to go through all
yeah,
these other sources to try and
that's right.
find them, and all these other things to try and find them.
If they
I
hadn't
have
been
no
thieves, if they
yeah,
hadn't
I
been thieves and witches, we wouldn't know anything about
we
them at
wouldn't know
all.
anything about it. Yeah, like if it wasn't for that 6078 court case, and if it wasn't for the witch trials, I would know nothing about
And the
Dorcas
restitution later on,
and the
where
restitution after the
Leonard
witch
and Rachel
trials.
are
Yeah.
identified as brother and sister, and the children of Tabitha, we wouldn't know anything about them.
Yeah. It's so
So
funny. I found myself just like rereading things over and over and over again. Like the Essex the quarterly court records, which is all about the thefts. I just found myself like reading it and then like going and trying to write something and being like, wait, hold on. Reading it again and then seeing all of these names that come up over and over. Like the book belonged to John Sampson. The book of palmistry belonged to John Sampson, but then this is the same guy that then accuses them of beating the cow. So then I'm like talking to my husband and being like, conspiracy, and then going on all of these rabbit holes about
yeah,
that too.
this is why we don't take exception to being called history nerds, because we actually like doing this.
Absolutely. I understand that for sure. We've got a few questions and comments, and I'm going to start here with, I guess this was Barbara. You wanted to know if Leonard changed the spelling of his name when he became a sexton, like SLUE versus
Mm.
SLEW.
Leonard Slew can't write. He can't write his own name.
Oh,
So
so it would be a
it's
misspelling.
just however who's writing it down feels like spelling it.
Uh-huh.
Very common. Very well. There are
Yes.
people, Whipples, also they tend to spell their name the same way over generations, but they also are capable of writing their own names. People at the Hoar, Dorcas, at the Hoar and Galley level, and Hoar spelled various different ways. Galley is spelled various different ways. People who can't write their own names, don't worry about how to spell it.
And sometimes in the same document, it's written different ways.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Mhm.
Whoever's writing it at the time feels like writing it down.
Yeah. Um, yes. And I see here, Joel has some pretty interesting observations. He notes that she prefigures the Dred Scott case, the Dred Scott decision, which is really fascinating. There's a research project that someone could get on. And
Oh, that's a whole nother question and a whole
yes.
nother century. And I'd love to talk about that for an hour and a half.
Yes, exactly. But Joel is informing us that this is like the Taney ruling in the Dred
Ah,
Scott
yeah, yeah,
case, which
yeah.
said something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing, um, no black man had any rights that a white man was bound
That's
to
right. That's right.
respect.
Yep.
Uh, so this is just fascinating to see.
The
The
continuity
yes,
of this attitude of this racism, the continuity of this racism covers centuries.
yes, the continuity of it, the complexity of it, and the stupidity of it. But yes, it's absolutely incredible stuff. hmm let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, more on the Dred Scott case from Joel that, let's see, that ruling also distinguishes, um, I think that might be a typo, status vis-a-vis, oh, blackness category of not human.
Yeah, yeah,
So we've got Slew as Scott. And then Joel points out that there's very interesting clarity about anti-blackness versus racism, which a lot of scholars point out these days because it's all racism, but there are different types of racism, such as anti-blackness and uh, whatever other ethnic group fits in there. So Joel says, but different legal outcomes. Um, so it's really interesting.
yeah. I
Yeah.
think part of this is in the 18th in the 18th century, and is there's this transition, particularly as we get into the revolutionary period, where we have common law, where really the interpretation of the law is left up to the juries. The justices they kind of run the session and they make certain that everything is legally filled out correctly and rule on is she a spinster or not and that kind of question. But the interpretation of the law is not dictated by the state and it's not determined by judges. It's determined by each individual jury because the law is really local. And so that's the importance of these juries ruling against the enslavers, that they are actually changing the law, okay,
Wow.
themselves, which is, and I'm not a legal historian, so this,
Yeah.
but I understand that there is what happens then with the revolution, with the institution of a constitution by the state, a written constitution, and then later on by a constitution of the United States, is that you get larger governmental bodies, the state and the federal government, who start determining what the law is, and the law is written down. So common law is passed. There are some books for judges to use, and there's a very big book that comes out about this time period where the name is escaping me, but someone in the chat will surely remind me as to what the law should be. But that's this time of transition where common laws was really there for local people to solve their problems, to solve their differences. The witch trials are unusual because it's a different kind of court. It's the court oye and termine, where the state is really running these things and making these decisions. But mostly people go to court because they just need somebody to kind of adjudicate their differences. Did your cow
Wow.
break through my fence, or was your fence broken already, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And what the fines for that should be, and all that. Those are really very local decisions. So
Wow.
what's changing is the fact that, and I think, the 1783 cases in the new state constitution, we start saying the state's going to determine this specifically, who can be enslaved or who cannot be enslaved, or that no one can be enslaved. And we're not going to have local
Mm-hmm.
common practice followed anymore.
Yes. Yes.
So
I
Uh,
wanted to make a
by
note.
Dred Scott, we have the Supreme Court deciding what the law is.
mm, very, very complicated.
I wanted to
Um,
just make a note real quick is for
Mhm.
the witch trials are so different because the witch trials of 1692 rather are so different and handled such a different way in the courts because they blew up so quickly. There were so many people
Yeah,
accused so
yeah,
fast.
yeah.
Whereas prior to the witch trials of 1692, all of the other witch trials that you see are handled the same way that Jeanne was describing, of very local, very decided by the community and decided by building up the evidence of all of that. But basically, there's this decision that's made because so many people are accused so quickly that like it's just going to bog down the court systems, really. So we
uh-huh.
make that decision to have those specialized courts in 1692, and
Yeah.
it's such an extreme case in 1692. But prior to that, like the Margaret Jones, who was the first person executed for witchcraft, that was like a local, or first person in Massachusetts rather. That was just like a local
Yeah.
case, seen
And
to
if
like
you read,
anything else.
yeah, and if you read Dr. Baker's Storm of Witchcraft, that's one of the points that he
Mhm.
brings out, that it's the state, basically, the governor and the ministers from Boston who kind of descend on this whole situation and create. And there's also a lot of other things going on. And one of them is that the whole basis for law at all in the state has been ended because England has ended the name of the game. The governor is actually off in London at the time trying to get a new uh,
It's our charter.
Ah,
yes,
Yeah,
charter, right?
our
So
charter
really, the
expired
courts are supposed to
earlier
have
this
been
month.
suspended. There's supposed to be no courts. Okay, so they have to have a special court in order to try these cases. And
ooh,
I
boy.
mean, really, you got Storm of Witchcraft. I think Dr. Baker does an excellent job of showing how
Mhm.
this is really, as Krystina says, is blown up so big. There's so many people involved that the state has to descend and take charge of these things.
Aha. Um, let's see. Just one. There's like two more questions, but they relate to the same thing, and we should probably, kind of pack up our bags because it's a little past 8:30. But two people here just wondered about they weren't aware that mixed race relationships existed or would be allowed or were not prosecuted in Massachusetts, or that they weren't handled the same way in the South. To which I
Oh,
say, oh, what you don't know. But but either of you or both of you want to take that on, the prevalence or the
well,
commonness
um,
of
I will say that a lot of the mixed, and of course, it depends on what you're talking about in terms of race.
right.
But a lot of what they would think of as mixed race at the time were not white and black, but rather Native American and black. And there are a
Hmm.
lot of different reasons for that. So there are different terms used to for to call the children of these relationships. Um,
Yeah.
and mulatto is a very common one that you see, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the mother or father were white and the mother or father were black, but it might have been Native American and black. But there are cases,
Hmm.
and in fact, one of the later freedom suits, the uh, the attorney for the enslaved person says clearly he's not all black, clearly not 100% African descent. Clearly, they're really basing it just upon how he looks and saying, but we don't know, is the mother or the father white? So uh, it's not unusual. And most of them, of course, never make it to court, and are you see them referenced sometimes in the civil records. You see them referenced sometimes in the criminal cases, although not very often. Race is not usually identified in the criminal cases for a reason I haven't quite figured out yet.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's a lot more common than you would think, or than
Yes.
even the records show. These
Well,
people
then
just don't show up in the records.
you also have the whole instances of when white enslavers are having children with their enslaved
And
people
that's right. That's right.
as
And
well.
nobody wants to talk about
Nobody
that,
wants to talk about that.
north or
Still,
south.
still, don't want to talk about that. Didn't exist. Okay, folks, it is 8:36, and we're so glad you gave this presentation. It is quite an eye-opener, and I'm still marveling at your keeping track of the research. Um, Maybe all of you on this call could join us next Thursday because we've got that presentation by Francis Bremer on what was
It's going to
happening
be
in
really
England.
interesting.
Yes, there
Mm.
it is. And again, there's, well, later in the month, I don't recall the date offhand right now, maybe the 19th, I think it was, where we're going to have another historian talking about what was going on in England. So we've got all of this tyranny and liberty, and that stuff never stops, does it? No, very timely discussion. So thank you all for attending this session, and thank you, Jeanne and Krystina, for sharing your knowledge with us and enlightening us and giving us the ability to raise even more questions because so many of us tend to think that this was all figured out and it's over. But there's a lot more to be uncovered. So thank you.